The Marine recognized the nurse. Full script introduction. There are moments in life when the past catches up with you in the most unexpected ways. For me, that moment came on a Tuesday afternoon in a sterile hospital corridor, when a wounded Marine looked into my eyes and whispered a name I hadn't heard in over a decade. What happened next would unravel a secret that an entire platoon had been ordered to forget. But before I tell you what that Marine revealed, let me introduce myself and explain how I ended up carrying a burden that was never supposed to see the light of day. Chapter 1. My name is Lauren Fitzgerald, and I've been a registered nurse for 17 years. I work at Memorial General Hospital in San Diego, California, where the Pacific breeze mixes with the scent of antiseptic, and the constant hum of medical equipment creates a rhythm I've grown to find comforting. I moved here from a small town in Nebraska, where cornfields stretched endlessly, and the biggest excitement was the county fair. Nursing chose me as much as I chose it. After losing my grandmother to a condition that better medical care might have prevented, I knew I wanted to dedicate my life to helping others survive their darkest moment. San Diego became my home 8 years ago, but before that, I spent 3 years working as a civilian contract nurse at Forward Operating Base Sentinel in an undisclosed location overseas. Those years changed me in ways I'm still processing. The heat was unbearable, the dust got into everything, and the sound of helicopters became as familiar as my own heartbeat. I treated soldiers with injuries that still haunt my dreams, held hands of young men crying for their mothers, and made decisions that medical school never prepared me for. On that particular Tuesday, I was finishing a double shift when the emergency department called for additional hands. A military transport had arrived with casualties from a training accident. As I rushed down the hallway, my scrubs still stained from a previous patient, I had no idea that my carefully constructed present was about to collide violently with my buried past. The automatic doors opened, and I stepped into organized chaos. Paramedics shouted vital signs, doctors barked orders, and in the middle of it all, on a gurney with a leg injury, was a Marine in his early 30s who locked eyes with me and went completely pale. His reaction stopped me mid-stride. Recognition flickered across his face, followed by something that looked like fear mixed with relief. Before I could process it, he grabbed my wrist with surprising strength and pulled me close. His breath was ragged, his pupils dilated from pain medication, but his words were crystal clear and deliberate. "Nurse Fitzgerald," he said, using a name I hadn't gone by professionally in years. "We need to talk about Corporal Martinez and what really happened that night at Sentinel." My blood ran cold. That name, that place, that night. It was the secret I'd been running from for over a decade. If this story has already grabbed you, go ahead and subscribe to the channel now, because what comes next is going to surprise you even more. And I want to know, where are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments below. Let's see how far this story reaches. Chapter 2. The Marine's name was Staff Sergeant Dylan Hayes, and after his leg was stabilized and he was moved to a recovery room, I knew I couldn't avoid the conversation he demanded. I requested a break, something I rarely did, and found myself sitting beside his bed with my hands trembling in my lap. The fluorescent lights hummed above us, and through the window, I could see palm trees swaying in the evening breeze, a stark contrast to the desert landscape where our paths had first crossed. Dylan looked at me with an intensity that made it clear he'd been carrying this weight just as long as I had. He began by telling me he'd been part of 2nd Platoon, Bravo Company, stationed at Fob Sentinel during the same period I worked there. He was just a corporal back then, young and idealistic, believing the mission mattered more than anything else. He remembered me as the nurse who never slept, who was always in the medical tent when casualties came in, who treated everyone from the commanding officer to the local interpreters with the same level of care and respect. I remembered those days differently. I remembered exhaustion so deep it felt like drowning, moral compromises that kept me awake, and one specific night that shattered whatever innocence I'd brought to that desert. Dylan leaned forward, lowering his voice even though we were alone. He told me his platoon had been on patrol the night of October 19th, a date burned into my memory like a brand. They'd encountered an IED, and in the chaos that followed, Corporal Adrian Martinez was critically wounded. But that wasn't the whole story, and Dylan knew it. He explained that his platoon had witnessed something during the evacuation, something that should have been reported through proper channels, but was instead buried under direct orders from their commanding officer, Major Richard Thornton, a man whose name still made my stomach turn. What Dylan described next confirmed my worst fears. His platoon had seen me disobey direct medical evacuation protocols. They'd watched me refuse to leave Martinez behind when Major Thornton ordered the medevac helicopter to depart without him, citing resource priorities and tactical considerations. Dylan's voice cracked as he admitted his platoon had been told Martinez was a lost cause, that using the helicopter for him would risk other lives, but I hadn't accepted that answer. Dylan remembered me screaming at the major, remembered the pilot hesitating, remembered me climbing into that helicopter with Martinez against explicit orders, and he remembered what happened next. Thank you for staying with me this far. It shows you're feeling what I felt when I lived through all of this. So go ahead and subscribe and hit that notification bell, because what comes next changes everything. Chapter 3. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand who I was back then. I wasn't the seasoned, somewhat cynical nurse you'd find today in San Diego. I was 26 years old, fresh from finishing my emergency nursing certification, and fueled by an almost naive belief that every life could be saved if you just tried hard enough. FOB Sentinel was my first deployment as a civilian contractor, and I'd volunteered for it specifically because I wanted to test myself in the most challenging environment possible. My family thought I was insane. My father, a retired postal worker, couldn't understand why anyone would choose to go to a war zone, but I felt called to it in a way I couldn't explain. The base itself was a sprawling collection of prefabricated buildings, concrete barriers, and watchtowers surrounded by endless sand and scrub brush. The temperature regularly exceeded 115 degrees during the day and dropped dramatically at night. Water was rationed, electricity was unreliable, and privacy was a luxury no one enjoyed. I shared a small containerized housing unit with two other nurses, Michelle and Diane, both veterans of multiple deployments who took me under their wing and taught me how to survive in that environment. The medical tent was our domain, a place where rank mattered less than skill, and where we saw humanity at its most vulnerable and most resilient. Corporal Adrian Martinez arrived at FOB Sentinel 2 months before the incident. He was 23 years old, from a small town in Texas, and had an easy smile that made everyone around him feel a little less homesick. He'd joined the military to pay for college, dreaming of becoming a teacher someday. We'd talked a few times when he came in for minor issues: a twisted ankle, heat exhaustion, the usual complaints. He told me about his younger sister who looked up to him, about his mother who lit candles at church every Sunday praying for his safety, about the girl back home he planned to marry when his deployment ended. He was exactly the kind of person who reminded you why the work mattered. The night of October 19th started like dozens of others. The sun had set, bringing blessed relief from the heat, and I was finishing paperwork when the radio crackled with reports of an IED strike. Within minutes, the base exploded into activity. The medevac helicopter was already spinning up on the landing pad, and I was grabbing supplies when the first casualties arrived. Martinez was among them, and his condition was catastrophic. Shrapnel had torn through his abdomen and right leg, and he was losing blood faster than we could replace it. Major Thornton arrived, assessed the situation with cold military efficiency, and made his decision. Martinez was priority 3, expectant, meaning he was expected to die, and resources would be better used elsewhere. I looked at Martinez, at his terrified eyes, and I made a different decision entirely. Now I want to hear from you. Where are you watching this story from? Write it in the comments below. It's amazing to see people from so many places following stories like this. And if you're invested in finding out what happens next, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what comes next. Chapter 4. What Major Thornton didn't know, or perhaps didn't care about, was that I'd spent the previous month researching and preparing for exactly this type of injury. I'd studied battlefield trauma protocols obsessively, had discussed worst-case scenarios with the other nurses, and had even practiced emergency procedures during the rare quiet moments we had. When I looked at Martinez, I didn't see a lost cause. I saw specific injuries that could be addressed if we acted fast enough and if we had access to a surgical facility that the base didn't possess. The nearest field hospital with the necessary equipment was 30 minutes away by helicopter. Every second counted, and Thornton was wasting those seconds with his calculations. I'll never forget the moment I challenged him. The major was standing beside the helicopter, shouting over the rotor noise, directing the loading of 2 other wounded soldiers who had priority 1 status. I approached with Martinez on a stretcher, 2 medics helping me, and demanded he be loaded as well. Thornton's face turned red, visible even in the dim light of the landing pad. He told me in no uncertain terms that the helicopter was at capacity, that Martinez wouldn't survive the flight anyway, and that I was to return to the medical tent immediately. That's when I said the words that would define the rest of my career. I'm not leaving him behind, sir. Either he goes on this helicopter or I quit right here and carry him to that field hospital myself. The medics froze. The helicopter pilot, a warrant officer named Chen, who I'd become friendly with over the previous months, looked between Thornton and me with obvious discomfort. For a moment, I thought the major might physically remove me from the landing pad. His jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists, and I could see him calculating the consequences of either decision. Finally, he leaned close, so close I could smell the coffee on his breath, and told me that if I took Martinez on that helicopter against his orders, my contract would be terminated immediately upon return, and he'd personally ensure I never worked in a military medical facility again. I looked him in the eye and said I'd live with that. Then I climbed into the helicopter with Martinez. Dylan Hayes described watching this scene unfold from his position near the perimeter. His entire platoon had been standing down after the patrol, waiting for clearance to debrief when they witnessed the confrontation. He said several of them had wanted to intervene, to support me somehow, but military protocol kept them locked in place. They watched the helicopter take off with me inside, watched Major Thornton storm away, and heard through the base grapevine that something significant had just happened. What they didn't know was whether Martinez survived. What they didn't know was that Major Thornton had immediately begun a campaign to bury what had happened, to rewrite the incident in official reports, and to ensure no one ever questioned his decision-making authority again. During that helicopter flight, with Martinez's life literally in my hands, I worked with an intensity I'd never experienced before. The pilot pushed the aircraft to its limits while I compressed wounds, adjusted IV lines, and monitored vital signs that kept dropping into dangerous territory. Twice, Martinez's heart stopped, and twice I brought him back. By the time we landed at the field hospital, my hands were covered in blood, my scrubs were soaked through, and I was running on pure adrenaline. The surgical team took over immediately, and I collapsed on a bench outside the operating room, shaking uncontrollably. A doctor came out 2 hours later and told me Martinez was stable. He'd live, but his recovery would be long and complicated. I'd saved his life by refusing to give up on him. Chapter 5. What happened after that night became a blur of confrontations, paperwork, and threats that I didn't fully understand at the time. Major Thornton made good on his promise. My contract was terminated within 72 hours, and I was escorted off Phoebe Sentinel with minimal explanation provided to the other medical staff. Michelle and Diane were told I'd violated protocol and was being sent home for review. The official version of events, the one that went into military record, painted me as a nurse who'd panicked under pressure and made emotionally driven decisions that endangered a medevac operation. Martinez's successful surgery was downplayed, described as luck rather than skill, and my role in his survival was systematically erased. I returned to the United States confused, angry, and emotionally devastated. I'd saved a man's life and been punished for it. The military's medical contracting agency blacklisted me informally, making it nearly impossible to find similar work. I spent 6 months unemployed, living with my parents in Nebraska, questioning whether I'd made a terrible mistake. My father tried to be supportive but couldn't hide his disappointment that my idealism had cost me such a promising career opportunity. My mother worried I was depressed, which I absolutely was, and kept pushing me to see a therapist. I resisted, believing I just needed time to process what had happened. But time didn't heal those wounds. It only taught me to hide them better. Eventually, I found work at a small hospital in Omaha, starting over in an environment where nobody knew my history. I rebuilt my career slowly, proving myself reliable and competent, avoiding anything that might draw attention or controversy. I dated occasionally, but never let anyone get close enough to ask about the gap in my employment history or the shadows I carried. After 3 years in Omaha, I moved to San Diego, attracted by the climate and the opportunity to work at a larger facility where I could disappear into the anonymity of a big staff. I changed my professional name slightly, going by L. Fitzgerald instead of Lauren on official documents, hoping to create distance from my past. For 8 years, it worked. I became just another nurse, competent but unremarkable, helpful but not heroic. But I never stopped thinking about Adrian Martinez. I'd searched for information about him dozens of times over the years, trying to find out if he'd recovered fully, if he'd returned to duty, if he'd gotten to marry that girl from his hometown. Military privacy regulations made it nearly impossible to track him down, and I had no way to contact his platoon or anyone else who might know his fate. Eventually, I convinced myself that he was fine, that he'd moved on with his life just as I was trying to move on with mine. I told myself that saving his life was enough, that I didn't need to know the rest of the story. But sitting in that hospital room with Dylan Hayes, I realized how desperately I'd been lying to myself. I needed to know what had happened to the man I'd risked everything to save. Chapter 6. Dylan Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his hospital bed, and I could see the weight of what he was about to tell me. He explained that his platoon had been ordered into a briefing room the morning after the Martinez incident. Major Thornton stood at the front, his posture rigid and his expression severe. He informed them that the previous night's operation had been complicated by unauthorized actions that jeopardized base security and medevac protocols. He told them that Nurse Fitzgerald had been dismissed and that her judgment had been compromised by stress. Then came the part that made Dylan's voice drop to barely a whisper. Thornton told them that any discussion of the incident outside official channels would be considered a breach of operational security and could result in courts-martial. The platoon understood what was really being said. They were being ordered to forget what they'd witnessed witnessed, to accept the official narrative, and to never speak about it again. Several members of the platoon had questions, particularly about Martinez's condition and whether he'd survived, but Thornton shut down those inquiries immediately. He told them Martinez had been transferred to a medical facility in Germany and was being treated according to standard protocols. That was all they needed to know. The briefing ended, and the platoon was dismissed with the clear understanding that this topic was closed permanently. Dylan admitted that most of them complied without protest. They were young, trained to follow orders, and didn't fully grasp the moral implications of what they were being asked to do, but Dylan had been troubled by it from the start. He'd watched me fight for Martinez, had seen genuine compassion and medical expertise in action, and couldn't reconcile that with Thornton's characterization of my actions as reckless and emotional. Over the following weeks, he quietly asked around, trying to piece together what had really happened. What he discovered disturbed him deeply. Thornton had been facing criticism from higher command for resource management issues at FOB Sentinel. Medical evacuations were expensive, both in terms of equipment costs and helicopter availability for other operations. There was pressure to reduce non-essential medevac flights, and Thornton had apparently decided that Martinez didn't meet the threshold for evacuation. My Defiance had exposed that decision-making process in a very public way. More disturbing was what Dylan learned about Martinez's official status. According to military records that Dylan managed to glimpse during an administrative assignment, Martinez had been classified as recovered and returned to duty after 6 months of rehabilitation. But Dylan's attempts to contact him through official military channels hit dead ends. Martinez wasn't listed in any of the databases Dylan had access to, wasn't assigned to any active unit, and seemed to have vanished from the military's institutional memory. When Dylan asked his platoon sergeant about it, he was told firmly to drop the subject. When he pushed harder, he received a written reprimand for unauthorized access to personnel records. The message was clear: leave Adrian Martinez alone, and don't ask questions about what happened to him. Chapter 7. Dylan leaned back against his pillows, exhaustion evident in every line of his face. What he told me next felt like a punch to the gut. About 3 years after the incident, Dylan had been deployed to a different region when he encountered a soldier who'd been part of Martinez's rehabilitation unit in Germany. Over drinks one evening, Dylan carefully brought up Martinez's name, framing it as curiosity about an old case from FOB Sentinel. The soldier's reaction was immediate and strange. He looked around nervously, then told Dylan he shouldn't be asking about that situation. When Dylan pressed for details, the soldier admitted that Martinez's recovery had been complicated not just medically, but politically. According to this soldier, Martinez had indeed survived the surgery I'd fought so hard to get him to. He'd spent 2 months in Germany undergoing multiple operations and intensive rehabilitation, but during that time, something had changed. Martinez had become increasingly agitated and angry, not about his injuries, but about how he'd been treated at FOB Sentinel. He'd apparently learned through other wounded soldiers that Major Thornton had tried to leave him behind, that his survival was due to a nurse who'd defied orders, and that the official reports painted an entirely different picture. Martinez had started asking questions, demanding to know why the records didn't match what had actually happened, and threatening to go public with his version of events. That's when things took a darker turn. The soldier told Dylan that Martinez had been visited by military legal officers and military intelligence personnel. The conversations were supposedly about his future career prospects and ensuring he understood the sensitive nature of combat operations. But the soldier believed Martinez was being pressured to stay quiet, possibly threatened with charges related to operational security if he spoke out. Shortly after those meetings, Martinez had requested and received a medical discharge. He'd left the military with full disability benefits, but had also signed extensive non-disclosure agreements that covered his entire deployment experience. The soldier remembered thinking it was unusual and feeling uncomfortable about the whole situation. Dylan had tried to find Martinez after learning this information. He'd searched social media, public records, and even hired a private investigator at one point. Every search came up empty. Adrian Martinez, the young man from Texas who'd dreamed of becoming a teacher, seemed to have disappeared completely. No social media presence, no address listings, no marriage records, no teaching certifications, nothing. It was as if he'd deliberately erased himself from public view, or been helped to disappear by people with the resources to make that happen. Dylan had carried this knowledge for years, feeling guilty about his platoon's complicity in the cover-up, and increasingly convinced that something deeply wrong had occurred. When he saw me in that emergency room, he recognized an opportunity to finally share what he knew and perhaps find some answers. I sat in stunned silence, processing everything Dylan had revealed. The man I'd saved had survived not just his physical injuries, but also a system that wanted him to disappear. And now, more than a decade later, I was being confronted with the reality that my act of defiance had consequences far beyond my own career. Martinez was out there somewhere, possibly hiding, possibly threatened, definitely silenced. The question that consumed me was simple but overwhelming. What had happened to him, and why was the truth about that night so dangerous that an entire military apparatus had worked to bury it? Chapter 8. I left Dylan's hospital room in a daze, my mind racing with possibilities and fears. For years I'd convinced myself that walking away from that chapter of my life was the healthy choice, that dwelling on it would only cause more pain. But now I understood that walking away had been a form of cowardice, a way to avoid confronting the larger injustice of what had happened. Martinez deserved better. He deserved to have his story told truthfully, and he deserved to know that the nurse who'd fought for him that night hadn't forgotten about him. Over the next several days, as I continued my regular shifts at Memorial General, I couldn't stop thinking about how to find him. I started with the basics, spending my evenings searching every database and public record system I could access. I looked for Adrian Martinez in Texas, in California, in every state I thought he might have relocated to. I searched for teaching certifications, property records, business registrations, anything that might indicate where he'd gone after leaving the military. Every search yielded either nothing or hundreds of results for people with the same common name who clearly weren't the person I was looking for. It was frustrating and demoralizing, and I began to understand why Dylan's private investigator had failed. If Martinez wanted to stay hidden, he'd done an excellent job of it. Then I remembered something he'd mentioned during one of our conversations at FOB Sentinel. He'd talked about his hometown, a small place called Redford in far west Texas, right on the border with Mexico. He'd described it as a community where everyone knew everyone, where his family had lived for generations, and where he planned to return someday. It was a long shot, but I decided to take a personal approach. I requested a week off from work, booked a flight to El Paso, and rented a car for the 3-hour drive to Redford. My colleagues thought I was taking a vacation to explore Big Bend National Park. I didn't correct them. This was something I needed to do alone. Redford turned out to be even smaller than I'd imagined, a cluster of modest homes and buildings along the Rio Grande with a population of barely 100 people. The landscape was stark and beautiful, all desert colors and endless sky, and the sense of isolation was profound. I checked into a small motel in the nearby town of Presidio and began asking careful questions. At a local diner, I mentioned I was trying to locate an old friend named Adrian Martinez, who'd grown up in the area. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, told me there were several Martinez families in Redford, but that most of the younger generation had moved away for work. She suggested I visit the community church on Sunday, where the remaining families gathered. Chapter 9. That Sunday morning, I drove to Redford's small Catholic church, a simple white building with a bell tower that looked like it had been standing for decades. The service was in Spanish, which I understood only partially, but the warmth of the community was universal. After Mass, I approached an elderly woman who seemed to be at the center of the social gathering. I introduced myself carefully, saying I was a nurse who'd served overseas and was trying to locate Adrian Martinez, whom I'd known during his military service. The woman's expression changed immediately, a mixture of sadness and caution crossing her face. She introduced herself as Elena Martinez, Adrian's aunt. Elena invited me to her home, a small adobe house filled with family photographs and religious icons. Over coffee and homemade pan dulce, she told me what had happened to her nephew. Adrian had indeed returned to Redford after his medical discharge, but he wasn't the same young man who'd left years earlier. The physical injuries had healed reasonably well, though he walked with a slight limp, but the emotional and psychological wounds ran much deeper. He was angry, paranoid, and deeply distrustful of authority. He refused to talk about his military service beyond vague references to betrayal and cover-ups. His family tried to support him, but he pushed them away, insisting he didn't want to put them at risk. Elena's voice broke as she described watching her nephew deteriorate. He'd attempted to start college using his military education benefits but dropped out after one semester, claiming people were watching him. He'd gotten a job at a local ranch but quit after a few months for similar reasons. Eventually, he'd told his family he needed to disappear for his own safety and theirs. He'd left Redford about 5 years ago, and they'd had only sporadic contact since then. He sent occasional postcards from different locations, never with a return address, just letting them know he was alive. The most recent postcard had arrived 4 months earlier from somewhere in New Mexico. Elena showed it to me, a generic image of desert sunset with a brief message on the back. Still here, still fighting, love to everyone. I told Elena about that night at FOB Sentinel, about how I'd fought to save Adrian's life, about my own career consequences, and about how I'd spent years wondering what had happened to him. She listened quietly, tears streaming down her face, and then she hugged me tightly. She thanked me for saving her nephew, and told me something that changed my entire perspective. Adrian had mentioned a nurse, she said. In his darker moments, when the paranoia and anger overwhelmed him, he'd talked about a woman at the base who'd cared when no one else did, who'd fought for him when the system system wanted him dead. He'd never known my name, but he'd carried the memory of that night as proof that not everyone in the military had been corrupted. I was the evidence that humanity still existed in that machinery of war. Elena asked if I wanted to try to find Adrian, to tell him who I was and what I'd learned. I struggled with that question. Part of me desperately wanted to see him, to know he was okay, to finally close that chapter of my life. But another part worried that showing up might make things worse, might draw attention he'd worked hard to avoid, might confirm his paranoid fears that people were tracking him. Elena seemed to understand my hesitation. She suggested I write him a letter, which she'd try to get to him through the informal network of family and friends who occasionally heard from him. I agreed, and that evening in my motel room, I wrote the most important letter of my life. Chapter 10. In that letter, I told Adrian everything. I introduced myself properly, explained my role in his survival, and detailed what had happened to me afterward. I shared Dylan Hayes' story and what we'd uncovered about the cover-up. I apologized for not trying harder to find him sooner, and for not fighting harder against the system that had tried to erase both of us. Most importantly, I told him that his life had meaning, that saving him had been the most important thing I'd ever done, and that he didn't need to hide anymore because people finally knew the truth. I gave him my contact information and told him I'd be there whenever he was ready to talk. I sealed the letter, gave it to Elena, and drove back to San Diego, not knowing if he'd ever receive it or respond to it. 3 months passed with no word. I'd returned to my routine at Memorial General, but everything felt different now. I'd reconnected with Dylan Hayes, who'd fully recovered from his leg injury and had become an unexpected ally. He'd decided to file a formal statement with military oversight committees about the FOB Sentinel cover-up, accepting whatever consequences might come. His courage inspired me to do the same. I contacted military medical contracting oversight agencies and submitted detailed reports about Major Thornton's actions and the systematic burial of what had happened. I didn't know if anything would come of it, but at least the truth was now part of the official record somewhere. Then, on a Wednesday evening, my phone rang with an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, assuming it was spam, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was hesitant and rough, like someone who didn't talk much anymore. "Is this Nurse Fitzgerald?" he asked. My breath caught. "This is Lauren Fitzgerald," I confirmed. There was a long pause, and then he said, "You saved my life. I never got to thank you." It was Adrian Martinez. We talked for over 2 hours that night. He was living in a small town in New Mexico, working construction under a slightly different name, and slowly rebuilding some version of a normal life. Elena had gotten my letter to him, and reading it had been the first time in years he'd felt like someone actually understood what he'd been through. Adrian told me he'd been threatened directly after his medical discharge. Military intelligence officers had made it clear that speaking about his experience at FOB Sentinel would result in criminal charges, loss of his disability benefits, and possible imprisonment. They'd framed it as protecting classified information and operational security, but Adrian knew it was really about protecting Major Thornton and the decision-making failures that had nearly cost Adrian his life. He'd signed the non-disclosure agreements because he didn't see another option, but the guilt and anger of staying silent had eaten away at him for years. Learning that I'd also been silenced and punished made him realize we'd both been victims of the same corrupt system. Our conversation ended with a plan. Adrian agreed to come forward publicly with his story, to cooperate with military oversight investigations, and to reclaim his identity and his future. I promised to stand beside him throughout the process. In the months that followed, both of us gave extensive interviews to military investigators and eventually to journalists who were interested in the systemic problems we'd exposed. Major Richard Thornton, who'd retired with full honors and was working as a defense contractor consultant, faced renewed scrutiny of his military career. While he was never formally charged with anything, his reputation was significantly damaged, and several of his decisions at FOB Sentinel were officially criticized in a report. More importantly, Adrian and I both found something we'd been missing for over a decade: closure and validation. We'd both made the right choices that night, even though the system had punished us for it, and by finally telling the truth, we'd prevented future nurses and soldiers from being silenced the same way. Today, Adrian is enrolled in college again, studying education just like he'd always dreamed. We stay in touch regularly, and he's told me repeatedly that I gave him his life twice, once in that helicopter, and once by helping him reclaim his story. For me, finding Adrian and fighting for the truth has been healing in ways I never expected. I'm no longer running from my past. I'm proud of what I did that night at FOB Sentinel, and I'll never again stay silent when I know something is wrong. So I want to hear from you now. What would you have done in my position? Would you have fought for that soldier, knowing it could destroy your career? Would you have spent years searching for the truth like I did? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've made it all the way to the end of this story, please subscribe to this channel for more real stories from nurses who've lived through extraordinary experiences. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next story. And make sure to watch the recommended video that's coming up next, because there's another powerful story waiting for you. Thank you for listening to mine.